Let's play with our crumbs and create a 9-patch quilt block that is perfect for a chain style quilt. For this block, you will need crumbs, scraps, strip sets, and leftover pieces. You can even chop down larger pieces. Just throw everything in a pile. You will also need background fabric, which I highly recommend something in a high contrast or a solid, or basically a print that reads as a solid. Nothing busy since we want to make our scraps outshine everything else. Now let's begin. First, you will take scraps of fabric and start sewing it together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After you've sewn a couple strips together, our goal is to cut 4 2.5-inch squares and 1 4.5-inch square. And since this piece has varied lengths, you can also trim off the excess or play with it and cut it in half since we are cutting out a smaller quilt block. After I've sewn a couple strips together, our goal is to cut 4 2.5-inch squares and 1 4.5-inch square. And since this piece has varied lengths, you can trim off the excess or play with it and cut it in half since we are cutting out smaller quilt blocks. That way we can get more variation within the quilt block, and of course save the excess because you can use it later on within another piece. Now I first want to create my 4.5-inch square. For ideas, you can sew multiple smaller units together, or if you have a larger scrap piece, you can sew that together instead. There are no rules with creating a scrappy quilt block. The strip that I am adding has these cute lemons. Instead of sewing my unit to the top of the strip like normal, I'm going to sew it by the lemons, that way it will appear like a fussy cut. Now here is where we can have some more fun. When you are cutting out your 4.5-inch square, you can rotate your ruler around if your unit is large enough to get an interesting diagonal lines. But sometimes when you do this, it will end up with pieces that are smaller than an inch, which can be a hassle to add to another unit later on. Or you can keep it simple and cut it out like a normal square. But once again, there are no rules to creating your scrappy block. It is whatever you like. Here I am going to quickly sew up another to show you how creative you can get with smaller scrappy strips. These are leftover trimmings from my other scrappy blocks, and this is why when you trim things down, keep it because you can use it later on for some of these smaller quilt blocks to give it a little bit of pizzazz. Now I'm going to cut out 4 2.5-inch squares. With my leftover trimmings from my 4.5-inch square, I can already cut out a single 2.5-inch square, which I will do so. Then with the extra piece, I will continue to add on to it. And here is another thing that could happen if you have some triangular scraps and sew them to another piece. That won't matter. Just keep adding onto it until you can cut the size that you need out. Now that my pieced unit is large enough, you can see that it is a weird scrappy mess, but I am able to cut out the remaining 2.5-inch squares that I need. Another idea is if you have a piece of fabric that has a lovely pattern within it, you can go ahead and fussy cut that out as well. And of course, save your scraps from trimming all around it. But now that I have enough squares to make our block, you will need to cut 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch background rectangles. You'll place the 4.5-inch scrappy square in the middle with the 2.5-inch scrappy squares on the corners. Then as always, sew your pieces into rows, and lastly, sew your rows together to complete a 8.5-inch quilt block. Feel free to make as many quilt blocks as you like, other blocks. You can even alternate between a background 8.5-inch square to give it a more modern chain-like scrappy quilt. But I do hope you have enjoyed today's fun little twist. If you could please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you can be notified for your next amazing quilt project.